Hello, this is the debut episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
Even though this is our debut episode, and this would be the best time to introduce ourselves and give you background on us and why we're doing this podcast, we'd rather defer that conversation to a future episode and get right to the subject of this episode, Stranger Things. But before we do, the only thing we'd like to say as introduction is that this and all future episodes are not reviews. We're assuming that you've seen all 8 episodes of Stranger Things. And just a heads up, for the next episode, we hope that you will be prepared by having watched The Witch, which I'm really excited to talk about. So, Chad, it seems that we've both come to Stranger Things with very, very different takes on what concerned us the most. I think I have a more contrarian view, maybe, than you about this show. So maybe we should start with you. Before starting this podcast, we spoke about one of your main interests in horror as being what I think we decided to call the rules of engagement. That within any given genre, what constitutes our understanding of that genre is like this set of rules that we specifically or vaguely identify. And the rules shift and evolve and dissolve, and each work follows those rules to some degree. And it seems that that very idea as what you saw as being central to Stranger Things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about Stranger Things is that it doesn't deviate from the rules of genre in any way. Like, everything works the way you would expect it to work in a genre film of this type. You know, there's like a mirror universe that has its own rules, and it's really, the entire series is framed by 2 games of Dungeons and Dragons played by the main squad of boys. And the very first time they play is, I think, like really an homage to E.T., because E.T. opens the same way with a bunch of kids playing D&D. And, you know, this show is just made for people who grew up into adults who were like that. I mean, that's exactly how I was at that age. I was hanging around, not in a basement because Louisiana doesn't have basements, but a side room playing Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the things about Dungeons and Dragons, one of the pleasures of it is everyone who played read all the rule books. So you would read the monster manual, you would read the Dungeon Master's Guide, you would read the player's guide, no matter who you were, and if you were really into the game. So you knew exactly what it meant when the Dungeon Master who's running the game put down a Demogorgon. Like, you knew that creature's stats, you knew that creature's abilities, you knew what you had to do to fight it and overcome it. And in the very beginning of the show, you know, they roll out the Demogorgon. They talk about how Will has to make the decision on how to fight it. Is he going to cast Fireball or is he going to cast Protection? And there's some back and forth, which kind of tells you a little bit about each of the characters. Like, Lucas is, you know, kind of the voice of reason of the whole show, and he's like, just cast Fireball. And then Dustin's kind of the kid without the teeth, is the nice guy. And then Will Byers, who disappears, he kind of disappears in a weird way because he doesn't actually use his pistol, or not pistol. He picks up a rifle right before the monster takes him in the first episode, and he doesn't really get to use it. He's like kind of hesitant to it, and so the monster grabs him, which basically shows that the foreshadowing from the game is the foreshadowing of the whole show. And even like when we talk about later at the end, the whole series ends with them playing D&D, and they talk about all these loose ends in the game, like the Lost Princess or the Lost Knight or all those weird flowers in the underground world. And then they pull out another monster, which is basically a Demogorgon with a whole bunch of different heads. So it kind of tells you where the series is going to go. And when you think about the rules of D&D, like, it's like very on rails, but also very imaginative. And I think that's kind of what I would describe Stranger Things. It's totally on rails, but very imaginative.
And how do you feel about the way it not adheres to the rules of D&D specifically, but the rules, because D&D has a rule book.
Right.
Horror film, the rules kind of got made up as filmmakers went along.
Sure.
And I, you know, as we've talked about, the rules of horror are something that are really interesting. It's sort of like why we like slasher films is sometimes because they're all the exact same.
Right. And
it's interesting to see how they deviate or innovate. But how do you feel about how Stranger Things applies to, even though it's not exactly horror,
right.
but it adheres to the rules enough that it's worth talking about in the context of horror very heavily.
Yeah, it's, you know, I think it does adhere a little bit to the horror rules. Like, Barb gets taken when her friend is having sex, you know, so there's that.
Check.
Yeah, check. The one black kid lives and is never really in danger, which is a deviation of the normal horror
really
rules.
is.
Yeah, it's really like a total deviation. Although he does get smashed by 11 at one point. So there's that. There's other things where it breaks from the rules too, like the shitty boyfriend who at one point Barb even his girlfriend even refers to him as a cliche. She's like, "You're such a cliche," and he's like, "So what?" And I really like that moment in the show because it's acknowledging what he is, and then later on when he turns out to be a pretty decent guy because he comes back and saves them and the weird kid. There's all these like playing with the rules, like they never get too far from them. You're always in the view of them. And I don't know if that you could break and have like a really unusual horror movie and have it be successful. If you could totally upend the rules and have crazy things happen.
What would we say? What has maybe, can you think off the top of your head, is horror, but has broken the rules? Because if it breaks the rules far enough, it's not horror. It's a rom-com or it's some, generic action movie or whatever. But what has broken the rules the most, but still is like clearly horror film, right?
I mean, you would have to go almost back into horror literature to like see where the rules are like not yet formed, because I think, I can't think of anything that really breaks the rules like hugely. Maybe Nightbreed a little bit because it puts the focus on the monsters, and then the townspeople are kind of the monsters that come to destroy them, and then the guy who's supposed to be helping the protagonist ends up being like a serial killer, and even then it's just kind of a reversal of perspective. I can't think of anything that gets really, really far away from the horror rules that we could all articulate under pressure.
Yeah. True. And I hope we get to talk about Nightbreed sometime soon, because that's a really fascinating, it's such an imperfect movie, but it really does invert a lot of rules, and not only invert, but like even just what a film is. It's so decentered. It's so unclear just what we're supposed to be following or focusing on.
Yeah. And then Stranger Things is a little bit like that. Like who are the heroes? There's a lot of different, there's two divisions, I think. There's the world as the kids see it, and then the world as the adults see it. And, there's a scene when they first get 11 into their house, and they basically make this pact that they can't let the adults know because they'll come down on them and they won't be able to find Will. But at the same time, you have Chief Hopper, who is a badass out there really doing the hard work to find Will. He really breaks a lot. If this was a case, he breaks the case, and then I didn't think about him as much the first time I watched it as I did in the second time I watched it. And the second time I watched it, I really thought about him as the main protagonist, which was, I don't know why that happened, or if it was something they would have designed, or if it's just I was tired when I watched it, or what.
Right. Well, I think it does, it's modeling itself after 80s, like Spielberg films or whatever, or it's modeling itself after a lot of different things. But one thing that I think it can't help but do, given that it exists now, is have multiple protagonists with their own agendas and multiple storylines in a way that, it's not like that's something new, but it is concretely now. This is what television is primarily doing. That's where our interest mostly holds, is these multiple storylines that you can follow one by one. And that's a break from, E.T. isn't like that. Stephen King novels aren't like that. And so that's one of the breaks from tradition, is following the new television paradigm. But I think that, I'll just kind of talk about what I found most interesting and most frustrating.
Yeah, I'd also be curious, like on balance, did you like it or not?
I enjoy, I think I watched it before you and I had even talked about doing a podcast. So I had zero agenda at the time, which I totally have now. But while I was watching it, I think I was like, this is pretty good. I'll probably rewatch it someday. It's good enough that I would, watch it again after I get through, I don't know, rewatching Damages or something like that. There was a lot about it that was fun, but the agenda I did come to it with, for better or worse, is that I really have issues with nostalgia as a creative tool. And I think it's way overplayed. And what was interesting to me about Stranger Things is that it is sort of like no one has topped this for nostalgia pastiche. Like it has raised the bar so hard on what can be done by stringing together a bunch of nostalgic reference points. But at the same time, I find even doing that to begin with really suspect, aesthetically and politically.
Sure.
Politically, for me, the main comparison I can think of is like, it's obviously a reference to Stand By Me, right? Or one of the references. And Stand By Me was shot in the 80s, and it was a reference to like 59 or somewhere around there. And the early 80s especially, was rife with references to the late 50s, early 60s, this mythological, simpler time. And that was a real issue. What were people in the 80s yearning for? This fake, simpler time in America. It's incredibly, pardon the P word, it's incredibly problematic. It was incredibly problematic.
Sure.
And I feel that this show is doing that to the 80s. It's sort of looking back to the 80s as this simpler time. It's not taking into consideration how totally fucked up that era was. It's just sort of glossing over that edges.
Ironically, one of the better reviews I read about it was in National Review, right? So when we think about like nostalgia for the 50s, you think about Reagan and like the early 80s Republicans who were like, to a simpler time. And now you kind of have that like, make America great again. And there's this like, this veneration of Reagan, right? Yes. You're like, oh my God, he was like, he's the king of the 80s, according to certain people. Yeah. But in National Review, they described Stranger Things as the 80s as it actually was, which is sitting in the wreckage of the 60s. Which I thought was really an interesting way of putting it, because it's like, okay, whose nostalgia is it? So you have this, the National Review is about as right as it gets. And they're talking about, what's very forward in the film. Once you get past nostalgia, it's a show about broken homes. The Wheelers are a totally broken home. Chief Potter, his marriage is wrecked by the death of his daughter. And the Byers family is the one that's wrecked. Will Byers' mom is divorced. And then the Wheelers, it's a typical boring nightmare, horrible like relationship where the father's just like reading his paper, checked like, out. What did I do? Yeah. What did I do? What did I do? Like he has no idea.
Yeah.
In that family dynamic, once you get over the nostalgia of the show, I think that's kind of the more interesting thing, is like, how do people from these weird broken homes sort of exist? And for the most part, and I was kind of raised that way, you're left alone, which is one of my favorite things in the show is, the kid just goes in the shack and has access to a .22 rifle.
Yeah.
Crazy. Like they go into a survivalist store or like an army surplus store and just buy a bunch of just dangerous shit. And the guy at the counter's like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, hunting monsters. That's it. Totally reasonable explanation in 1983. So I think from that, it's like, who's nostalgia? Like, so who do you think, from your perspective, what is the nostalgia in this show? Who's it made for?
I think that I don't know that I can answer the question, who's it made for, because I think I don't want to put intent. I don't want to necessarily think of the writers and the directors and the producers as having an agenda. I'm more sort of concerned with like, well, what is this doing? And I think the show is for everybody. It obviously will appeal to people like you and I who play D&D in basements or didn't have access to basements. And maybe kids that are that age now who can sort of just relate to feeling like outsiders, sure, as we all do, and that's sort of a dominant aesthetic right now. Is the nerds won. That's the dominant voice in pop culture, right, is the frustrated, misunderstood outsider, whether that person is actually in control or not. But I think that I don't want to dismiss all of the things you were just saying about the characters in Stranger Things and what kind of, it wasn't just these perfect models of the suburban nuclear family. But neither was Stand By Me. But
Yeah.
and it's still that. I mean, Stand By Me was written by Stephen King, and it's still about going to look at a dead body, and there's violence, and there's anxieties and things like that. Whereas in Stranger Things, I think exactly what you were describing, these things about like autonomy and guns, is exactly sort of like a moment we are shooting for right now. That there is so much anxiety about a lack of autonomy, a lack of autonomy from government, a lack of autonomy from parents. The kids in this show are not even free-range kids. They're just kids.
Yeah.
And that's how I was raised. The show, the way it's nostalgic for me, I don't expect it to be nostalgic for many other people. But I don't think that's what nostalgia necessarily is, because nostalgia is necessarily a fiction.
Sure.
And it was in Stand By Me, and Stranger Things is now. I mean, I think that, for example, how that illusion is created, I think is sort of demonstrated in Stranger Things by two uses of song. One is, I don't know the name of it, Old Time Rock and Roll by Bob Seger, I guess. They sing it for a little bit, and it's definitely a reference to Risky Business.
Right.
Clever.
Well, he's singing it, like the boyfriend is specifically singing it because he's talking about how much he looks like Tom Cruise.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that song is, I think, cleverly about nostalgia. But it's also a conservative type of nostalgia. It's like it used to be. It's a song about how things used to be better. Music used to be better. And that is fucking bullshit. And anybody who says that about any point in time is clearly just demonstrating their anxieties about their own era, that things are possibly changing for the better. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, so
I have a part two. But
no. And maybe you'll say this, but in a way, this is almost saying like horror used to be better. You could make that argument, right? Because I mean, we were talking about what new horror movies we liked the other day, and there's nothing I love that came out in the last few years, and I'm hoping as we explore newer movies, but I wonder if there's a search. Oh, right. Well, which I haven't seen yet, but we'll do in the next one. But really the major update for horror, at least from what I understand in The Witch, is style, like cinematography, style. Yeah. It's attracting better actors, like as horror kind of, horror is like heavy metal in the way that it is just perennially successful. Like no matter what, like you can make an okay horror movie and it's going to sell well. And, now you're combining nostalgia with horror. And I think as much as I love Stranger Things, I know I'm going to hate and shit all over all the nostalgia horror that comes after.
Yes.
Because we got Guardians of the Galaxy, which is okay. And then you get Suicide Squad, which is, from all accounts, like basically ripping off Guardians of the Galaxy, like all the same notes. Like, hey, here's a bunch of baddies that listen to 80s music. So I'm wondering,
is that what it is?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, are we going to get the new version of Night Shift, or are we going to see Near Dark, but, updated? I don't know.
No doubt.
Yes. Yeah. So I interrupted you in your part two.
Oh,
yeah.
No, I was just thinking about two songs that really sort of like had these moments for me about how nostalgia was functioning in Stranger Things. And the other was the Clash song, the Should I Stay or Should I Go, which is another like, clever, gone, character's gone, song about, a return or not. And, that song is like the Clash were like incredibly leftist. I wouldn't call them anarchist, but like they were a very political band, and that was their runaway apolitical hit.
Right.
So to focus on that song is, I don't want to call it a rewriting, and I don't want to over-determine or overstate this inclination, but it just seems that like two of the focal songs that the characters actually interact with, like there's all this 80s music in the show, but those two songs like kind of come to the fore.
Yeah.
One is a nostalgic song, and the other is this apolitical song from a very political band that's not about anything really. And I think that really speaks to the nature of this show.
Right.
That it's sort of stripped of the barbs and edges that could potentially have made it interesting. Not, and by interesting I don't mean follows my political
Right.
ideologies. I just mean edge. And the show was, for I think those reasons and many others, totally lacking in edge. It was perfectly nice. I mean, it was a little gross, so maybe my mom wouldn't like it. But other than some, some violence, it's pretty fucking tame.
Yeah, I was really curious to see what a kid of the age of the kids in the show would think of it. And I went to a party over the weekend, and there was a little kid. And he was total like a little grom, like a skateboarder punk kid. Like 11 years old. His parents are totally into vintage motorcycles and stuff. So he's definitely going to be growing up with a slightly different perspective. But he was all about it, And
Cool.
he didn't get in. He hadn't seen all the previous movies, but it really like spoke to him. So I guess there is still a contingent of kids that are out there riding BMXs and carrying like knives from Vietnam and
Buying
shooting slingshots. It's hard for me to buy ammunition now. I can't imagine a kid would be able to get any. But it's just a cool show. And I think my introduction to it was every single person I know telling me I was going to love it.
Yeah.
And so it took me weeks to watch it.
Oh, yeah?
Because I was just resistant. Because people are usually, I don't know, I have a kind of weird perspective on things. So sometimes people aren't quite right in what I'm going to like. So I immediately sat down to watch it with the intent to just shit all over it. Like that was my immediate goal.
Yeah.
And it won me over pretty quickly. And I kept thinking about, if I sat down to dinner with somebody and they made me all of my favorite things at once, would I shit all over that meal? Right. If they made me like an In-N-Out cheeseburger and a deep dish pizza and some blackberry sorbet and, all at once, I'm not going to hate on that meal. I'm going to think of it as, it was totally constructed and maybe not totally cohesive, but enjoyable.
Right. I sort of feel like it might be, just to ruin your metaphor, if like In-N-Out burger with no salt and a sorbet with no sugar, and it's like, well, it's my favorite things, but the kind of the main thing that makes it good is strangely missing. It's a reference to all my favorite things without the thing that makes it good.
I think when put like horror is really good, and like I always think about like, is horror successful or not, is when it's addressing live anxieties.
Yes.
And I guess there's still potential of like nuclear winter and like, a kid being abducted from a latchkey home. Like all that stuff was like very much what terrified me as a little kid. Like the Russians, what were they going to do? Did somebody with a scary free candy van steal a kid from down the street? Was there a satanic panic? Like all that weird stuff. In the beginning of, the government fear, because like, for instance, in the show, MK Ultra, which is the thing that is, I guess, the base of all of the experiments that produce 11, is a real thing. It happened. Like the government did dose up people with LSD to try and get them to unlock telekinetic powers, which is crazy. And, like that story is when you hear some screaming mouth breather, to use a term from the show, talking about like Tower 7 or whatever really interesting conspiracies are going on, MK Ultra is at the heart of it, because you're like, well, what about that one? If there's that one, why can't there be other ones? And I think the MK Ultra line is the only through line to modern anxiety in the whole show.
Yep.
And so
it's funny. I couldn't think of any. And I didn't think of that, and I agree. I thought about like, well, what is this saying about today on horror's terms of addressing current anxieties? And I was like, I think that the very fact that it doesn't is the significant factor. This is a horror movie that is a meta horror movie that doesn't do that. And I think that was significant, and maybe in its favor. Like maybe it just somehow very deftly skirted. I mean, maybe this is a way of thinking about rules and not following the rules. Like, this one was so good at not addressing current social concerns very directly, the way almost any other film would.
I mean, think the last movie I can think of that like resurrected 80s social concerns was the Red Dawn remake, right? And so Red Dawn, I mean, for a certain type of kid like me, That's like the fantasy. You get some machine guns, run off in the woods with some pretty girls, and like kill Russians. I mean, it doesn't get a whole lot better than that. And then the Red Dawn remake tries to be the same, but it like moves the anxiety. Like, the Russians in the 80s were a great enemy, like unknowable, Ivan Drago from Rocky IV, like you had a thing to hate.
Yeah.
And, in the original, I don't want to get us too far off here, but, China was supposed to be the enemy in Red Dawn remake.
Oh.
But because the Chinese film market is so huge, they switched it to North Korea, which is ludicrous. Like, North Korea is never going to land anything. I mean, I don't even think they could land a ping pong team in America right now,
Yeah.
So they sort of lose that anxiety. And then the real anxiety now are things that, are mobilizing certain voters, like Islamophobia. There's all kinds of things, and like where people are almost afraid, I think, to make movies that address normal fears now, because the fears are so specific and so politicized. Like anything that you would say, oh, I'm freaked out by that, it immediately puts you in a political camp. So I don't know.
Well, I also think we're in a time where social concerns are so strangely polarizing that it seems that you make a choice. You either address it hyperbolically as clickbait, or you avoid any sort of conflict at any cost.
Right.
And I feel like this sort of avoided any conflict at any cost. I mean, we can sort of we could sort of think about this in terms of race, in terms of gender and things like that, and find a lot of issues throughout it. But by following a certain template that isn't too outright offensive, it sort of addresses nothing.
Yeah.
I'm repeating myself.
Well, except for like, we were talking about the MK Ultra thing, like the government remains the enemy in Stranger Things.
It's a great enemy always.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the enemy in Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters, the EPA is the enemy, which is interesting.
Very interesting.
You're like, oh, and like, who wouldn't be concerned? I mean, imagine putting an unlicensed ecto reactor in any neighborhood in San Francisco.
Yeah.
People are going to freak out. Like, they're not going to let it be there.
Yeah.
And so when you think about too, like, who's the most dangerous creature in Stranger Things, the monster doesn't kill nearly as many people as 11 does. Like, if you count like government workers, I mean, she just kills like 30, 40 people. And then the monster really just kills Barb, 2 hunters, a couple other people, the scientist at the very beginning. And she is a product of the government. She's a weapon. They made her. And so you have like, they're always the bad guy in this show. And I think that anxiety remains.
Right. Which I think is really interesting, the idea of the government.
Right.
Which is a knowable capital T they, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the gray men. It's not, the FBI. It's like the government. And I find that that's this really interesting enemy. We're talking about politics and sort of taking sides and things like that, that in a way, the government as the enemy can serve a leftist agenda as being the man, right? But also, there was a lot of ways in which, like Ghostbusters is a great example, a lot of 80s movies used the government as the enemy to sort of say something about government interference in free market capitalism.
Right.
I don't know where Stranger Things falls on that.
Yeah, but I mean, if you were to drop it, like if you were to take it at its face value and say it's an 80s nostalgia, then I mean, I guess it's the government of the 60s, right? That it just became too big but it's also like fighting the Russians. So it's sort of like the good guy in that respect. But, Well,
also, I think I remember, if I may, that when we talked about this show a week ago off mic, you found the Matthew Modine character sympathetic, or you seemed to... I remember you said something about liking that character, and I was like, he's fucking pure fucking evil.
What I said was that there's not really any character in the movie, or not, I keep calling it a movie, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because I basically sat down and watched it like an 8-hour movie, like it's some Tolstoy thing. But I I couldn't tell whether or not I liked him because he was Matthew Modine or because I thought he was like pulling off his sort of like fatherly vibe. Well, because you can imagine, like, if you say we were to write a fan fiction right now about that character, and we wanted to be a fan of that character. I mean, you would say like he raised this awesome weaponized psychic to go fight the evil empire. You know, very similar to like how the movie Hannah. You know, except for hand combat, you never know. And also, they touch the beyond. Like they find this creature in this weird space, and then okay, well, how do you stop this? Like that's just next door now. Like forget the Russians going to launch nuclear weapons. There is a shadow realm right next to us that none of us ever even knew existed, and pretty much the only thing that keeps it under wraps is this weaponized little girl. So
I sort of read it.
I mean, that's just one way of reading it. Like, if I wanted to push that direction.
I sort of read it that the Upside Down was uncovered by those very experiments, that it didn't exist.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. Like, they uncovered it, or I don't think they would have caused it because it's too developed, right? But they stumble across it, and it's like, okay, all of a sudden there's this way scarier thing next door.
Yeah.
You know, which is also kind of a modern anxiety, which is like, you know, next door terrorism.
Yes.
You know, it can come out of a tree, blow your face off. You know, it's some crazy shit.
That's hilarious. Yeah. So one thing we haven't talked about that seems to be, I mean, it seems to be most people I know's central concern about this show. Well, it seems that most people, when they post on Facebook about it, or the articles, the fucking listicles.
Right.
There are two things they focus on. One is the music, and one is I haven't read anybody using the word intertextuality, but the intertextuality of Stranger Things, the constant referencing, the deriving every single plot point, aesthetic, backdrop, set design is all references. I mean, those are two separate things. Like, the music and the...
I mean, maybe not. Like, I would take them together, you know? The music as intertextual.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I guess I have different things to say about
Oh,
each
yeah.
show.
I totally... I agree with your decision to parse them out completely.
The intertextuality of it, for me, runs the same issues as I was saying about nostalgia, is that... there are a lot of these listicles and, videos sort of like comparing like shot by shot, E.T. against Stranger Things. And, and it's, I mean, I found, of course, watching it becomes this game of like, oh, I caught that.
Right.
Oh, I caught that. Oh, I caught that. And then after a while, it's like, I don't care. This game is really boring. And I think we are raised in this era to be highly attuned to that, being raised on The Simpsons and websites like tvtropes.org, things like that. We are primed for that. Everything is so intertextual, and everything is this matrix of references that game is really fun. But I found that kind of trite after a while with this show, and it made me sort of think that these videos that compare scene by scene against Poltergeist and all that are the show. Like that, like if you just can hang with this idea, like
Sure.
Stranger Things isn't the 8-hour TV show you watched. It is the video on YouTube that compares the two things. It is that listicle. That listicle is just as much the show as slogging through watching Winona Ryder go through this terribly written script.
Right.
Well, her script.
Yeah. So one thing I'd say is I did the what Stranger Thing character are you? And I was very pleased to be Chief Hopper. God. I was very stoked because Chief Hopper has excellent knockout power. He finds things out. Really, really personally stoked on that. So I agree. It's there. And then I watched quite a few of those scene by scene comparisons, and I was really surprised by their total sameness. Take a franchise like Harry Potter, for instance. The fan theories are radically different. They're like, oh, was Snape actually evil, even though he's kind of evil, but not really at the end? there are all these like pretty interesting takes on them. You're like, well, I totally disagree, but it's interesting.
Yes.
Everything I've seen on Stranger Things is basically about the same. Like everybody has kind of the same perspective on it. It seems like everyone is seeing it in the same way, except for people who are just trying to like kind of like force something. You know, somebody one review I bristled at referred to Chief Hopper as mansplaining something, and I love Chief Hopper, so I'm not going to take that, which is just because I'm ridiculous too, you know. But it just seems very resistant to like modern criticisms because I mean I don't know why, you know. Like think of something now, like I mean to move into sort of radioactive territory. Almost every show you would watch now, you could make some sort of comment about modern race relations.
Yes.
This show absent. You know, there's one black character. His name's Lucas. It's not a thing at all. Like you actually, he and Dustin, you don't know anything about their home life at all, except for you see Lucas's house and it looks pretty nice.
You could say that Lucas is the angry black man. I'll just paint a little veneer.
Yeah.
I would not put that on the scripts, but that is one sort of trope that it just sort of
I mean, because he's definitely not having it in certain scenes, but he also, you know, he's right. He's usually right. You know, he catches Eleven manipulating the compasses. He is, I think, rightly afraid of what she can do. You know, and then he also has the most to lose because he's Mike's best friend. Like Dustin explicitly states that, like, yes, I moved here in 4th grade or whatever. You guys are best friends. Obviously, she's tearing you apart. So then it sort of like softens any sort of like angry, you know, like if he's angry, it's really jealousy, I think would be the more powerful emotion going on there. Right. He's like jealous of Eleven. So.
Yeah.
I don't know. What did you think of 11? You know, that's another point where people kind of...
11 was the thing about the show that I really liked. I think just as a personal thing, this isn't very interesting, but like I tend to gravitate towards androgynous, you know, gender fluid characters in any circumstances.
Right.
And the haircut goes a long way.
Right.
And she's a tween, so really with that haircut, you can't decipher her gender at all. And I think that, you know, I think we could sort of like think about her, again, the P word, problematic. There's certain problematic nature about the sort of like self-sacrificing main female character who is mostly just a conduit for the protagonist to sort of come to some realization or come out the other end. You know, she's the ET, but I mean, that sort of like dulled down female character is pretty tradition. I mean, I think that one way in which we can read an update to Stranger Things, like I was saying about following current TV trends earlier, something that she kind of is she's kind of the manic pixie dream girl. She's kind of got that, like, she's weird and zany and the main character's in love with her and doesn't understand her, and she's just kind of the vehicle for his growing or coming out the other end.
Well, I've two things to say about that after you say what you're going to say.
No, just
I don't want to talk over you.
No. And she's awesome. That's all. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, like, the one thing that I thought about immediately when you're talking about her gender fluidity is more often than not in the show, she passes as a boy. They talk about, there's a little boy in the diner. At one point, Chief Hopper thinks that maybe it's the buyer's kid, that somebody shaved his head.
Right.
And so it's interesting that they decide to dress her up as a girl when they're trying to sneak her in. In reality, they could have just thrown her in some of the boys' clothes and she would have passed as another one of their little buddies.
Totally.
Instead, they make this garish, terrible looking little doll.
It's kind of brilliant,
and
actually.
Like, you know, Mike's putting her makeup on.
Yes.
I mean, what business does he have doing that? I mean, you know, they have this terrible blonde wig and they throw her in basically an outfit from The Shining. Like, you can imagine one of the little girls wearing that sort of outfit. And, you know, they have her like riding on the back of a bicycle in this dress. It's pretty funny that they decide to like basically gender her.
Yes.
You know, the other thing I'll say though about her being the manic pixie dream girl is they make two references in the show to X-Men number 134. And at the very first episode, they're racing over X-Men 134.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then later when the boys are looking for Will Byers, they're like, I have your X-Men 134. And so when something's mentioned that frequently, it has to have some sort of weight, right? And so in what X-Men 134 is, it was at the time a contemporary comic that was right in the middle of the Dark Phoenix saga. And this is like super intertextual, I guess, and you'd have to be like the right kind of nerd to pick up on this. But, that specific episode is the one where Jean Grey, who has telekinetic powers, basically the exact same powers as Eleven has, she is forced into this kind of bad situation where her powers are being manipulated by an outside force, and then she basically blows up kind of and becomes Phoenix, which is this all-powerful super deity, and eventually becomes evil. So I think if you're going to see, like, this is something I think would be kind of interesting for season 2, is this return of Eleven, which is sort of pointed at the end, but she comes back basically super powerful, which I think the X-Men 134 reference sort of indicates towards. And then she was a character there was a love triangle in X-Men at that time between Cyclops, the corniest X-Men ever, and Wolverine. Yeah, and you even see that a little bit in the new movies. I think the first movie, X-Men movie, was basically the Dark Phoenix saga. I don't remember. They're so terrible.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think I've seen them all twice, and I couldn't tell you anything about any of them.
But I have like really strong memory of the Dark Phoenix saga because that's the first X-Men series I read.
Oh, far.
And even then, like, hey, it was totally made for me. But I don't know. Maybe that's just reading way too deep into that text. But I thought Eleven was great as a character.
And as an actor, like, people talk about, like, how good the kids are. And, like, I feel like the kids have a good rapport, but they're not necessarily good actors.
Right.
They just sort of created something really magic on screen. Whereas 11 was, like, really going through it. Like, she gave a really amazing performance for the camera and with the other characters.
Yeah. She's also the only kid in the show that has to act different than just kind of being a kid.
Yeah.
Like one thing I at first I was like, why does this one kid have no teeth? Like, what does that say about the show? And then I looked it up, and he just actually doesn't have teeth. Yeah, and they just kind of wrote it into the show, which I thought was kind of interesting that he was like so charismatic. I would have loved to see their screen reads to see like who they chose and why. Like what about those kids? Like, did they have them hang out together or what?
Right. I read that they actually had the kids read the screenplay of Stand By Me to like figure out who they wanted, which of course they did. So actually, I have a lot to say about the music, but I'm definitely curious about what you thought of the whole issue of the music of the show.
Well, so there's this thing that like new movies and especially new remakes do, like for instance, like the new Leatherface movies, where every single actor is hot. Right. And then Stranger Things doesn't do that. People, they're these kind of like normal looking characters, especially the cops look goofy. Whereas a normal movie, like every single person would have 6-pack abs, even the person like checking you out at the counter. And so it was cool that they resisted that. But the soundtrack is the all hot cast of soundtracks. Like every single song is good.
Right.
And that's that. I don't know. I mean, who knows? Like, I listened to only metal in the 80s, so it's really hard for me to connect to those songs. But, my wife was watching Stranger Things with me, and she's all about the 80s, right? And so she was like, oh, that's the song from Pretty in Pink. And the next movie she watched was Pretty in Pink. So I think she really responded to the soundtrack a lot more than I did. I loved the synth soundtrack, like I guess the score of it by Survive. I think I enjoyed much more than the nostalgia soundtrack. Like, somebody sent me a link to the Spotify soundtrack, and I was like, oh shit, yeah, it's gonna be all synth, and it's just all 80s music, and I was like, I don't know.
It's funny, backing up, you had said like you were maybe predisposed to dislike the show because so many people told you that you would like it. I sort of had the opposite thing where like everybody told me I would like it, and then I was like, cool, I'll probably like it, and then I kind of thought it was okay. But I didn't know, I've been a fan of Survive for, I don't know, like 3 years. I think they're pretty solid. They're really interesting. And I didn't know they did the soundtrack. So I kind of took the soundtrack at face value. And I don't know about you, but I tend to find film and TV soundtracks to be 99% of the time just bad music. Just and I don't mean bad as in like it's functional, therefore it's not good. I mean, it often not even very functional. Like, just take any movie that has some quality that you like, that is something you noticed. It's never the music, really, unless it's some soundtrack that pilfers through the 70s, 80s, and 90s or something.
Right.
Sweet Emotion comes onto the soundtrack and you'll remember that moment.
Right.
Not for good reasons. And most film soundtracks, like the fight choreography in a Bourne movie, you'll remember that. What was the soundtrack like? Well, you should not care. And that's a problem, I think, with films, is that it has been decided that film soundtracks do not matter and need to be in the background and need to be a very specific set of instruments carrying the narrative in a very predictable way. Not that the narrative is predictable. I mean, the music functions predictably.
Right.
And can be incredibly bombastic, but needs to be innocuously bombastic, for example, like in action films. And the exception to that is when a score is electronic. And that happened a lot in the 80s. And, it's really easy to watch old 80s, say, horror films that have like a John Carpenter or a Tangerine Dream soundtrack, whatever.
Sure.
And think of it as cheesy and weird and sort of like it pulls you out of the film for a moment, right?
Right.
It's sort of, and I think we may have a feeling that that's somehow distracting. If you're watching a film and not the song from the 70s that makes you go like, I love this song, it's awesome, but part of the score. If you pay too much attention to the score, I think we find that maybe a problem.
Right.
Like I shouldn't be distracted from the film by the score, but at the same time, you get distracted by good costuming. You get distracted by an awesome set.
Totally.
Or a special effect. Why not music? Well, music pretty much is never a distraction. And so the score itself in Stranger Things, I thought was really pretty fucking good.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of bored of it.
Like, I'll probably buy it when it's available.
Cool.
Yeah. Because I like that's the sort of thing I like to listen to when I'm writing at work.
Droning arpeggios.
Yeah.
However, I think that is an element that isn't necessarily authentic. It was authentic because we did have films in the 80s that, John Carpenter, Tangerine Dream, whatever, did have these synthy scores. So it's authentic to that. But this film stylistically, or this show, did it again, this show stylistically is pretty generic. The acting is pretty regular. The set design is unremarkable. The editing is just how one edits.
So we'll come back to the set design in a second.
Okay.
I don't totally disagree with you, but I have something to say about it. Yeah.
But the soundtrack is non-standard. It existed back then, but it wasn't your standard soundtrack style. And so I think the soundtrack, maybe why so many people are drawn to it, is it actually is not only anomalous for film now, but it was kind of anomalous for film then. It was mostly relegated to genre films.
Right.
And the odd, Thief or something, the odd non-genre film sometimes had very synthy scores. But set design. Yeah.
Well, we'll button up the score thing. I'm thinking about you would know more about this, but were synth soundtracks more affordable in the 80s? That would be a question I wanted to know.
Affordable?
Right. So, for instance, does John Carpenter save money making The Thing by doing his own soundtrack?
I don't know.
Yeah, because I know the equipment was more expensive, because sometimes there are these reasons, why only genre films? Like, what do genre films have in common? Budget. That's what I'm thinking of.
Yep.
When you have, and I remember seeing early ads for Moogs and stuff like that, like a symphony in one device, and you're wondering, okay, were they trying to get a vibe from the synth, or did the synth solve a financial problem for them?
Right.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that.
I really don't know, because I think that, obviously renting a studio with a small symphony is going to cost a lot of money.
Right. Those scary violins don't pay for themselves,
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, there are two things going on in genre films, given, and I'm sure this will come up every episode of our podcast, but the financial limitations of genre films. One is you have to just sort of improvise things, but then there's also this liberatory aspect to it. So it might be that synthesizers, which maybe John Carpenter already had or solved a financial issue, but it might also be that at the time, horror films were willing to take a risk that no Hollywood studio would like roll the dice on a bunch of Moog and DX7 soundtrack compositions.
I wonder how much the score from Clockwork Orange would have influenced it too. I mean, because that's maybe the earliest all synth score I can think of. I mean, there's probably something earlier than that. But so to move into set design, I think all the set design is done really well because it really does a couple things. Each person's house sort of tells a little bit of story about the family. You know, like you go into the buyer's house and it's just wrecked. Like Chief Hopper comes in and one of the first things he notices in the house, he's like, "What's this, Mark? Was this here before?" And there's a hole in the door and it's right in line where the doorknob hits the door. So like, does that mean the kid threw it open? Did somebody come in? You know, so one, it's telling a story about like how good and observant he is, but it's also telling you like, there's a single mom with two bad kids that are just wrecking the house.
Which she says specifically.
She's like, I have two boys. Look at this place. You know, and then, so it immediately made me think about, what's another like, you know, really curated set design show, which is Mad Men.
Yes.
Right. And then one of the interesting things about Mad Men is it's not just stuff from the decade. It's stuff that would have been around from the previous decades.
Totally.
And so that's what you see in Stranger Things is, you know, the Galaxy 500 that the one kid's driving. It's all this, back to the National Review article, it's all this refuse from the 60s kind of taking place in the 80s. And especially in this little small town, there's not really anything new. Like the newest car is the yuppie boyfriend's BMW, you know, which is at the time was an insanely expensive car, but you see them like painted flat black all over West Oakland now,
right?
Which is, you know, you're kind of remembering that, but and as the show goes on from series to series, I'm curious to see if they'll continue the same storyline or if it'll be sort of an American Horror Story thing where it's just another nostalgic season. Like, who knows, right? And then when I'm thinking about it, comparing it to Mad Men, in the very first season of Mad Men, all the sort of anachronistic stuff was really dialed up. Like if there was a soundboard, they would have the nostalgia just turned all the way up to 10. And you know, in the very first season of Mad Men, there's all this like funny stuff that you notice. Like the little girl comes walking in with a plastic bag over her head, and her mom isn't concerned that there's a plastic bag over her head. Right. She's concerned that the dry cleaning's on the floor. Right. Or, you know, a million things like that. Like Don Draper just throws a bunch of garbage on the ground, you know, and just drives off. And then the way that scene is filmed, it's very much the focal point. And I'm curious if Stranger Things will walk out season by season, and that nostalgia will sort of blend into the background a little bit, and it won't be as forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of a future season, I'm curious about it, and pardon my continued harumphing about this show, but part of me wonders if it needs to have a second season, because I feel like there's a way in which this show was a conceptual exercise in retreading all these references, and it did it. And it did it very thoroughly and successfully.
Right.
And as I said before, I sort of feel like the plot is slightly secondary. It's not a bad show, but like I'm not so desperate to see what happens to these kids as I am with so many other shows.
Right.
The thing that draws people in and that people are mostly talking about is the intertextuality of it. And I don't know that it's going to, 8 more episodes of referencing Stephen King novels and Steven Spielberg films is like with characters, you want to see what happens.
Sure.
With references, it's like, well, we've totally seen this. I feel like it would be like if season 2 of a show was the exact same plot point by point.
Sure.
Over again. I think they have a real challenge to, even to other people. Like I would suspect that most people, if it was as intertextual as season 1,
right,
would probably get bored of it too.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is season 2 if I wrote it.
Go.
Okay. So it totally ends up basically being Alien, right? There's the alien egg. Will Byers pukes up a creature at the end. He has a tentacle in his mouth, very similar to Alien. In the first series, you're introduced to one creature. You go into the realm. It's super scary. There's clues of how big it could be, like how big a xenomorphic universe could be. In the second season, they go into that universe and just go to beat the shit out of whatever aliens are in there, and with the intent to weaponize whatever xeno technology is in there. That's how I could see a second season going in. And then you have basically more of a conspiracy. Like, how do you keep crazy extraterrestrial weapons testing under wraps in a small town? And then it's obviously people who live in that town work there, right? Like, you have all these people, and then you've had something like 40 people killed that work there. What does that do to a small town?
Totally.
So that could be kind of an interesting route to take.
Definitely.
Yeah.
One other complaint,
which is basically just aliens, when the Space Marines go in and just kill everything.
But the show is basically ... anything. So,
right. Yeah.
Pill for aliens some more.
Yeah.
Go for it. One other thing that is anomalous to the time frame that it's drawing from, that actually I think is really shitty, is the CGI of the Lotus head, or whatever people are calling it, the big bad. Mm-hmm. I think of all the things to not do traditionally, to not do practical effects and do a sort of like
super weird, right? You'd think if you were that big of a nerd about making a movie like that, that creature has to be a practical effect.
I actually know the actor, the performer who played that character, Marc. Mm-hmm. So it's a person.
Right.
But there's just so much CGI attached to his presence that I think I would rather have just seen a scary looking dude with some plastic shit on his head, and it would have been scarier and kept us in that world. I just listened to the Bret Easton Ellis interview with John Carpenter, and that's something that really, is, I mean, it's a bunch of grumpy old men going like,
right,
practical effects. But really, like, if you see an effect in a film, especially in horror, you're going to be pulled out no matter what. It's not real.
Right.
Two people talking, you can suspend the window of disbelief and go like, these are two people and I'm observing them and they're having this real interaction. But as soon as there's violence, it's not real. So one of two things happens. If it's a practical effect, you go, wow, they did that really well. Or if it's a CGI effect, you go, wow, they did that really well, or poorly, either way.
Right.
But the thing is, when it's CGI, you're pulled into computer effects and out of the world of the film.
Right.
Whereas with practical effects, it's probably not going to look realistic either, but at least you're still in this fabricated world of a bunch of people in a room with a camera rolling.
Yeah, I think there's just something about the eye. Maybe it touches on that uncanny valley thing where you just pick up on it being weird. Like, there's two movies to look at if you want to see it, is Christopher Nolan's Batmobile versus the Batmobile from Superman versus Batman. Like, the Superman versus Batman Batmobile is super CGI. It's jumping around, moving around, and your eye just doesn't buy it. Whereas, I mean, you can see the Batmobile from Christopher Nolan's films on Jay Leno's garage. I mean, it's an actual thing. It drives around. It's loud as fuck. It turns. I mean, and there's just something cooler about that. There's right now in San Francisco, there's the, what do you call it? The Stanley Kubrick exhibit. There's something about going up and being able to almost touch Alex's costume and seeing it. You're never really going to be able to see that monster. I mean, maybe they have some sort of practical effect or something like that in there, but I don't know. It to me, it's important, maybe because, I'm the horror fan that grew up reading Fangoria.
Yeah.
And putting us, kind of placing our show in the world of other podcasts. There are other horror podcasts that are very focused on that stuff and make really strong cases for that. And
well, I think it's like, don't want to swing too far off topic, but the Fury Road factor is that movie was almost entirely practical effects.
Totally.
And I don't know about you, but I spent half that movie going like, what the fuck is happening? Whereas you watch a Transformers movie and you go like, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah.
It's just the screen is really busy with shit that I don't care about versus like people actually almost getting themselves killed with machines. And I don't feel like we're being purists about tradition. I think it's just like what actually gets your heart racing and gets you involved.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know if like the eye catches it is maybe something just psychological that you don't see it. It's not believable. I mean, you're already asking an audience a lot to even think about like a creature that lives in a shadow world. Like when it doesn't look good, And I don't really have an opinion on what it looked like, really. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't feel strongly in favor. I don't think it was scary
Nope.
at all.
I did appreciate that it was largely in the shadows. You know, it didn't have long, well lit
Right.
camera investigations on what it looked like.
Right.
It tended
But
to be.
even like a basic horror scholar is going to know that it's always scarier to keep the thing in the shadows.
Yes.
You know, so like that's a B plus effort, you know, to me.
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of the big bad, whatever that is in this film, maybe this can be our segment we call methods of vanquishment.
Yeah.
Addressing what how the protagonists or antagonists get rid of the big bad.
Sure.
What did you think of how this season wrapped up in terms of the non-xenomorph and the government shadow agency and
Yeah, I mean, so the rules of the monster are like the kids make a pretty good effort to beat the shit out of it. You know, they catch it in a bear trap, set it on fire, they shoot it, and it survives. You know, it's tough, and ultimately, they make a bunch of references to like how like the slingshot is going to be the thing that kills it, and even the rock that Mike Wheeler falls on and it cuts his chin, that becomes like the magic rock that's going to defeat this creature. And it just comes down to the creature's analog 11 destroys it. So I mean, it's a little bit of the Deus Ex Machina, which I always mispronounce. I'm sure somebody can correct that, but you know, she kind of saves the day at the end. Ultimately, like there's that sort of removes the agency of anybody involved. If you need this godlike creature to kill this other creature, I mean, I guess it's just like you're stuck with like, okay, I hope I'm on the right side here,
Right.
you know. And then I would say, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I didn't think one way or the other. They disappear together. It really reinforces the idea that they're definitely paired. There's definitely some twinning going on there. Lucas, who is having none of it all the time, asked the great question, what if she's the monster? Which, you know, based on her body count, she might be. You know, if you were to take the Clerks analogy of like all the stormtroopers basically just being contract workers on the Death Star and the Rebel Alliance killing everybody, like maybe these are just government workers, man. They are just regular people that go home to people. They go home to their families, and this little girl has just murdered half the town. I don't know.
That's great. I have nothing to say. Actually, I have nothing to add. So I remember when we were talking about this last week off mic, you had brought up Tolkien as a reference point for the show. What were your thoughts?
So it's all over the show, right? So Will Byers' little house, his fort that they go to, which looks like a Calvin and Hobbes fort. You know, the password to get in there is Radagast, which is one of the characters from the Lord of the Rings series. They talk about the street that a lot of the action takes place on is renamed Mirkwood, which is this mysterious forest in the Tolkien series. And it's kind of interesting. The show does reference Stephen King. I mean, there's a character reading a Stephen King book. And then Chief Hopper takes care of business and knocks him out. But at the time, like Lord of the Rings would have been something that would have been a genre thing that all those kids would have connected over. Because back then, you don't have fan fiction in the kind of the way you do it now. I mean, like Dungeons and Dragons was the early versions are basically a combination of Lord of the Rings and Necronomicon. Like basically H.P. Lovecraft and Lord of the Rings. Like those are the two sources for all this stuff. And those are the two sources for Stephen King's writing. He always talks about there's really two sources of inspiration for Stephen King. He's always looking at like Lord of the Rings fantasy, which you kind of see really forward in series like Eyes of the Dragon or the Dark Tower series. There's this evil character, like his character, his kind of Sauron is Randall Flagg, which appears in various stories. It comes up in It, Eyes of the Dragon, the Dark Tower series, and The Stand. So there's that. But he's also really rooted in American English teacher fiction. You know, when you look at Stephen King's 83 books everybody should read, it's all sort of like hard-boiled Raymond Chandler or types of things that you would maybe read in an East Coast English department. It's very minimalist, a lot of men, that sort of thing. So, I mean, I guess it lays out the chain, the chain of influences. The Lovecraft stuff is there. I was even thinking about like Hawkins' Power and Light. It's HPL. Is that like a reference to H.P. Lovecraft? Who knows? That's it could be. I like to think it is. But the literary references are there. I would say it's probably the strongest literary reference outside of Stephen King, which is, you see Stephen King posters in the show. There's the entire opening credit sequence. There's a lot written about the font being taken from Stephen King covers.
Totally.
I mean, Lord of the Rings is a thing that all kids at that age read. I certainly read it. Yeah.
I didn't.
Oh, have you read it since, or?
No, I've probably read like 20 pages of the entire of any Tolkien.
Yeah.
I've read every Lovecraft short story though.
Well, here's the thing about Tolkien, right? Is he basically did what Stranger Things is doing. He was a student of Scandinavian lore, a student of medieval lore. And so Lord of the Rings is really just this exquisitely arranged retelling of all these old stories. So, I mean, very, very parallel to Stranger Things.
Yeah, no doubt. One thing I was thinking of earlier when we were talking about how people regard this show that I think is interesting is something that it does reminds me. I would love to coin a term here, and I just don't have a good one yet. But I went to art school and visual art, and we'd always have these critiques. And something that was really common and annoying is that if someone did work that didn't meet its own criteria and a person got called out on it, they would often go like, well, it's about that. If you're dealing in the realm of the conceptual and talking specifically about visual art, if someone was to go like, yeah, but you didn't finish the ends of this sculpture, you could just go like, well, it's about that. It's about being unfinished.
Right.
It's like, well, that might be true. So often it wasn't. So often it's an excuse after the fact.
Sure.
Making work in such a way that it is protected from critique. And I think that a lot of work in a sort of like post-irony era is like that. If everything is ironic, well, then there's nothing to commit to, and every term is flexible.
You always have an out. You're always like, I was like playing with that thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Stranger Things, although it's not ironic, it's pretty sincere, it runs that line too, because it's playing with intertextuality, because it's playing with all these moments in history that you can very easily go, oh, the Winona Ryder's character is really flat. Yeah, but it's about that because women characters in that era were largely, no. Like, maybe not. But if nothing, if it's totally impermeable by defense of, well, it's Stranger Things, well, it's about that.
Right.
It's a reference. Well, is it a reference to this or that? Well, whatever suits the excuse for upholding its credibility.
Yeah.
And I find that, and now I'm not maybe addressing it in and of itself, but rather people protecting it online.
That's a really good, I really like the way you say that, like protecting it, because I think like either the piece of artwork is doing work or the critic's doing work when you're kind of looking at it. And all that sort of stuff that you would add on to, criticism of the female characters or whatever, you kind of have to go out of your way to do that. I mean, it's really like you sort of have to bring your bag of grievances and unfold it and see what fits the best. And for me, like the worst thing that this show does is it doesn't advance horror in any way. Like if you're looking at horror as an art form, it just does not do any work advancing it. And in fact, I'm sure that this is going to be the case, that it actually regresses it. That we'll see period slasher films. I mean, we already kind of see that. That's Rob Zombie, like his entire agenda, which if one dude's doing it, cool. But, if we have to see a bunch of really corny versions of I Spit on Your Grave or whatever, I think that would be like a real harm to the genre. Like, especially when you have other other films really try and do the work of changing things. Like you, I haven't seen it yet, but you made a really strong case for The Witch being one of those movies that advances horror, or maybe not.
Just barely, maybe.
Okay, but any movement is good.
Yes, Yes, that's true. And we're in an era where movement is barely perceptible in almost any form, whether it's music or architecture or film or anything. There's not a lot happening that couldn't have happened 20 years ago. And we can't say that about, say, talking about Stranger Things. What was happening in the 80s was impossible to imagine in the 60s.
Right.
The 80s might be surprised by mobile phones, but as far as cinema and music and all that,
it's
few revolutions between 85 and 92, and then it sort of tapers off really fast.
I never see or hear anything that is shockingly different.
And that's part of why what's interesting about Stranger Things is, does this slam the book shut on, is this the final word on nothing is moving forward? Right. Or is this admitting that it can't? Or is this a last straw before, maybe somehow this will inspire people to just figure something else out?
Yeah, you would hope. I mean, this is sort of almost like the horror film, or I keep saying film. I mean, I'm just going to call it a film, whatever. Yeah. It's Fukuyama's End of History.
Yes.
It's like, okay, well, this is kind of where we ended up evolutionarily. This is where people sort of want to go. And what's the answer to that now is extreme returns to very severe, older ways of doing things. I mean, you look at it in this is going to take us off the rails here, but Slavoj Zizek during Occupy, he was basically like, well, you guys are going to have to figure it out. Otherwise, I'm just going to go back to communism. And that's kind of where I'm at. And so that's kind of where I'm at with horror is look, I'm just going to go read Cujo if you guys can't come up with anything cooler. Yes. I've really checked out of horror over the last 10 years. I really don't consume it the way I used to. And it's kind of that, I'm waiting,
Well, I mean, I think that follows an interesting pattern where when you get to be a certain age, which we are, traditionally, you start to check out, right? Mm-hmm. You get to a certain age and you stop paying attention to what's happening in popular culture. You stop buying clothes that don't look exactly like what you were wearing when you were 22 and were probably at your physical prime or something.
Speak for yourself, bro.
I'm not. Prime. I am not. I've never had one. But we genuinely are in this period, not where things were better when we were younger, but things were changing when we were younger. Things aesthetically, culturally, are not changing. Neoliberalism won. It's fucking over.
Yeah.
You're talking about Fukuyama, Simon Reynolds talking about retromania. Right. Music is stuck. Right on this table is Mark Fisher's book, Ghosts of My Life. He writes in Capitalist Realism.
Shout out to Capitalist Realism.
Totally. About, we can't imagine a world outside of capitalism. Regardless of what you think of capitalism, calling it the end of history is fucking terrifying.
Well, it's also I like that book, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think a lot of, you could criticize it or whatever. And I think a lot of people's natural criticism, which is, you don't know what the future brings. You have no idea, and then you have the outliers in that, like your Ray Kurzweils and stuff that think that robots are going to be the new thing. And I mean, I don't know. My phone can't make it through a full day with a single charge. So what's up?
And that's what we're terrified of.
Right. I think we have exhausted Stranger Things.
I think we have exhausted Stranger Things too.
Yeah. And maybe that's where we should end it, which is I watched it a second time in preparation for it, and the tricks sort of didn't work the second time. And on Facebook, I was having a conversation with people because I've been writing about it on my blog, and a lot of the writing I did initially was about all the Easter eggs. Like, holy shit, look at the Dark Crystal poster. Look, there's an Evil Dead poster on the wall. Dude's holding the Millennium Falcon. How crazy is that? Once you've seen it all, you're just stuck with the basic horror show. And it's really, there's no new ground broken. So once you've found Waldo, you just have a big old mess of illustration that is good or bad, depending on if you're into that sort of thing.
Oh my God. I was like gonna dismiss it as just being a big Instagram filter for 8 hours, but referring to Waldo is way more shady. So good.
Yeah, but there is the Instagram. I mean, I could totally see there being a Stranger Things Instagram filter, and it would be awesome, where everything's misty and every beam of light has a trace.
Those little feathery floaties in the air.
Yeah, like that, whatever that shit is, you know. I mean, I'm curious. Like, one of the conversations I had online from my blog was somebody said, "Oh, great, we have another show to obsess over, like Twin Peaks." And this isn't as singular as Twin Peaks is. You go watch Twin Peaks now, and the only thing that's really like gives it away are how slow the cuts are between, like the fade ins and fade outs. I think if that show were to recut today, would not be there. But that's it. You know.
Well, I think that one thing that Twin Peaks does that Stranger Things does not is that Twin Peaks, whether you want to call it a better show or not, no, it's a better show.
Yeah, but, well, it's a way better show.
Jesus Christ. But Twin Peaks is all these references and all these Easter eggs, but they're open-ended. Mm-hmm. You can go into these references and keep going and keep going and keep going. Mm-hmm. But once you go, Evil Dead poster, you're done.
Right.
You might, and maybe in the next scene, you're like, oh, I just caught another reference. So there can be more.
Yeah.
But there is a finite number, and once you get it, that's it. It's not like, oh, see, I picked up a clue from this and this and this, and those can spin off into ideas and interpretation. Right. You can't interpret the Thing poster on the wall. You can't interpret the Millennium Falcon being raised in the air, suspended in the air. It's just a one-to-one.
Yeah, I mean, Stranger Things really rewards you for genre consumption.
Yeah.
You know, the more of a consumer you are of that genre, the more the show reveals itself to you. Whereas I think something like Twin Peaks, the game it's playing is always to like subvert your expectation the entire time. That's it. And those are our scariest thoughts for episode 1.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And be sure and watch The Witch if you haven't yet. And come visit us to hear what we have to say about that. And meanwhile, we're going to be doing this as regularly as we can, probably about once a month.
Sure. We're busy guys.
Yeah. So subscribe, and the new episode will float ever so effortlessly into your mobile device.
It will haunt your dreams.
I'm Marc Kate.
I'm Chad Lott.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.